My child has a 99.997 recovery rate from COVID. I will not subject them to an injection still undergoing clinical trials.
As a father of four, I stand here today to say I don't consent, and I will never consent to any COVID injection of my children.
I will never inject my child with an experimental COVID injection.
I do not consent, and I will never consent to my children being part of the biggest human experiment of all time.
I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with the experimental COVID vaccine. I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with an experimental COVID jab. I do not consent.
I do not and will not ever consent to them having an experimental COVID jab. I will not have them used as sacrificial lambs for this so-called herd immunity.
I refuse to sacrifice my children for the herd. I do not consent.
I will never inject my kids with an experimental COVID-19 vaccination. I do not consent.
I do not consent.
I do not consent.
We do not consent.
I do not consent. Ever.
I do not consent.
We do not consent.
I do not consent.
I will never inject my child with the experimental COVID injection.
I do not consent for my children to ever receive the COVID injection.
I do not consent to my child being vaccinated by the experimental COVID vaccine. My child has his own natural immune system that will keep me safe. I do not consent. I do not consent. I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with the experimental COVID injection. I do not consent.
My child has a 99.997% recovery rate from COVID. I will not subject them to an injection currently still in clinical trials.
I will never subject my child to the experimental COVID injection.
I will never, ever inject my child with an experimental COVID-19 injection. I do not consent, and I don't ever consent, and I will never consent.
My child has a 99.997% chance recovery rate from COVID, and I do not consent to them being part of an experimental trial. I do not consent.
I will never inject my child with an experimental COVID injection.
I do not consent.
My child has a 99.997% recovery rate from COVID. I will not subject them to an injection still undergoing clinical trials. I do not consent.
I refuse to sacrifice my child for the herd.
I do not consent.
My children are not guinea pigs for Big Pharma. I do not consent.
I refuse to sacrifice my children for herd immunity. They have sacrificed enough in the last year and a half, so enough is enough. I do not consent.
I do not consent to my children being part of an experimental vaccine programme.
That I will never give my consent to vaccinate my children against COVID-19 with an experimental vaccine. So no, my children will not take part in this experiment.
I do not consent.
I do not consent.
I don't consent.
I do not consent.
We do not consent.
I will never inject my child with a COVID experimental injection.
My child has a 99% recovery rate from COVID, and I refuse to subject them to an injection that is still undergoing clinical trials. I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with an experimental vaccine. We have had COVID in this house. It came and it went, and we survived. Why would I take the risk to the adverse reactions? I will not consent to my children being lab rats for an experimental injection.
I will never inject my children with a COVID-19 injection.
That I do not consent to my children having this experimental treatment for COVID-19. There is no long-term safety data for this treatment.
I will never inject my children with an unlicensed experimental COVID vaccine that is still undergoing clinical trial. My children have a 99.997% recovery rate. I do not consent.
I will never inject my child with the experimental COVID-19 vaccine.
I will not inject my child with this experimental injection. I do not consent.
We do not consent to having our child who's 5 vaccinated, and there's not a hope that that's getting onto my child's arm.
I refuse to sacrifice my children and expose them to the documented adverse events such as myocarditis and severe neurological issues in order to protect adults. It's supposed to be the other way around. Children are innocent and defenceless. I will never consent to any mandatory unnecessary pharmaceutical product or intervention, especially this experimental injection. Enough is enough.
Parents, do not be afraid to say no. Have power and strength in your voices. Use it and defend them.
My children have a 99.997% recovery rate from COVID. I will not inject them with an experimental injection. I do not consent. I will never consent.